thank the speaker very much for their speech. I can confirm that my panelist is ready. Santiago, good to go? Yeah, awesome. In which case, I now welcome the leader of the opposition to open the op case. Here.
Hi, am I audible? Okay, I'll take POI 530 from the Greek.
Thank the speaker very much for their speech.
I'm very sorry. Anyway, okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. From a Western perspective, this is a prop-heavy motion because it relieves from the educational system something that is viewed as racist, problematic, etc. From a Balkan perspective, this is an op-heavy motion because it will create such backlash within these states. It will lead to rise of nationalist parties that are extremely problematic. We have had problems with them in the past few years, and this will increase their support, which will lead to negative policies within these countries in general, negative policies against the Turks specifically, and negative and anti-EU policies that will lead to, how do you say, anti-LGBTQ rights and these type of things, policies, etc. I'm going to divide this speech into very simple things. Firstly, why prop achieves nothing, and irrespective of whether or not this is taught in schools or not taught in schools, the average Bulgarian, Serbian, and Greek will be a nationalist and will care about these sort of things. And secondly, why this will increase the backlash in this sort of thing. Let's get into the first piece of framing. There are a couple of reasons why, even if you take it away, people will still care about this sort of thing. People will still be irrational for this sort of thing. Firstly, as PM concedes, most of the people have been through this educational system. Most of it has existed and perceived in this sort of people. Most sort of people know the common parts of the history, right? The different battles that have happened, the different, how do you say, operations that people have to lead. The Janissary. Do you know what the Janissary are? These are people, how do you say, whose like sons were taken from them by the Turks and were put in the army and these sorts of things. People are extremely persuaded by this narrative. This is not a regrets motion. This is, how do you say, overturned from the current moment. So the vast majority of harms also exist. Secondly, there are other sources of information that will push this narrative irrespective of the educational system. Firstly, the church propagates this all the time, right? In, how do you say, in different celebrations that we have, they talk about this struggle. In liturgies, they talk about this struggle. It exists. Secondly, the nationalist people and parties will also propagate these sort of things, will also showcase the importance of this sort of struggle because it's their base of identity and these sort of things. But thirdly, to the average Balkan person, this stuff is common knowledge, right? Like, this is very accessible. You open Wikipedia, you read about this stuff, people know it. But thirdly, notice that the occupation was for a very long time, 500 years. In this period, mosques were built. You have, how do you say, many Turkish buildings that were created and these sort of things. This is inter-family stuff. Many families have stories about how, about the troubles that they had throughout these type of centuries. People remember this sort of thing. It's an extreme trauma in this sort of case. What is the point of this type of rebuttal, this type of framing? Irrespective of whether or not this is taught in school, this will still be important to the identity of the individuals. The importance of this sort of thing will exist, and how do you say, your racism, your hatred will not be going downwards based upon this thing, etc. Because there will always be incentives that push you to do this sort of thing. Not if CG and CO try to run some kind of counter-identity bullshit, we already preempt this sort of thing, so they have to engage in our framing. Why will this lead to far-right backlash? This is the substantive part in the debate. So what I threw into this, none of the benefits of prop will accrue because people will not change, but they will asymmetrically become more nationalist, more harder when this is not in the educational system. Firstly, which are the parties that will most likely propagate? These are the nationalists. Not in Balkans, nationalist is not only far-right, it's also far-left. The communists are also nationalistic in these sorts of cases. These parties are extremely problematic. I'll get into the impacts why. But how is this likely to look like? Since this is such an important issue as I framed to you, this is firstly likely to be taught in media, both the nationalist media, but also the mainstream media. But notice, because mainstream media has at least some incentives to put all viewpoints, etc., they will put out these people, they'll have debates, and they'll talk about this sort of thing. So the average person will see this. But secondly, the average person will also talk about this when this happens. This will be huge news in the Balkans because it's so important, etc. Now, and this is the key analysis. Why will the reaction be negative rather than positive? Note, OG have no analysis as to why the reaction will be positive. So far as to give you some analysis, but not the best analysis in this debate as why it will be negative. We will win on this clash. Firstly, people are personally affected based on this on a couple of levels. One, in many of cases, the people who have fought in these sorts of places are national heroes. There are people like Selveliev that people, how do you say, have a cult of personality associated with them. Many people put in the shoes of these sorts of people. Many people associate the freedoms and liberties that, like, how do you say, the best analogy for this is the Americans and how they view their liberties and their, these sort of things. The Balkans are very much the same in terms of these sorts of things. So they understand the suffering, they understand this sort of thing, and when it gets removed, they'll view this as, how do you say, a discrimination, how do you say, a spit on the history in this sort of case. So they'll be radicalized, they'll be harmed. But second, it's an emotional, it's in our culture. We view this as being traitors to the educational process, us not valuing all of the sacrifice that these people did. This will be a deep emotional narrative for these people. But secondly, even if it's not the most narrative, they have media, they have rhetoric presence in many of these cases. They have, how do you say, they have very strong arguments, so they're able to push these arguments, but also stronger arguments, like slippery slope argument, for example. They'll tell you, first they do this today to you, tomorrow they'll do something else in this sort of case, etc. In this sort of case. Notice, we've already had example, like we had a scandal in Bulgaria, where basically we wanted to call the Turkish invasion from slavery to invasion, and there was huge backlash. The Nationalists got enormous percent, they got into parliament like never seen percentage, so it is a big impact sort of case. Before I move, why this doesn't happen on our comparative.
If you're claiming that most people in the Balkans are nationalist as fuck and already hate all the Turks and the Muslims, why does this actually change?
No. Look. You're mischaracterizing what I'm saying. I'm saying that this is an important issue to these sort of things, and these people will be relatively nationalist, right? So even if you take this away, they'll still be relatively nationalist. But if you take this away, this is the second point, they'll increase their nationalism. This is when they become more nationalist. This is when they vote for the Nationalist Party, and this is when they do problematic things. Now, why on the comparative will this not happen? Three reasons. Firstly, notice that people have different priorities. In many of the cases, people in Balkans are apolitical. Empirically, this is the case. Last election in Bulgaria, we had 38% turnover rate. People do not care about politics. People view politics as a dirty game because of all of the corruptions. But they will when you do this, when it is an emotional issue that they care about, that's when they go to the votes, and that's when you rise the number of parties. No, this is asymmetrical votes because these are people who otherwise not vote. But secondly, in many of these cases, these people will have normal incentives. For example, if you're a right-wing person, you'll vote for the capitalist party, right? In this sort of case. But when you put this specific issue, that's when you flip to nationalists, because now they cater to your issue more, because people value their culture and their identity more than their material circumstances when you push them to do so. But thirdly, and this I know is kind of bad to say, but in many of these cases, Balkan people are stupid. There is structural reason for this. People are poor, we had dictatorships, etc. So when you give them this specific issue, it's very emotional for them, it's very harmful for them, so they'll just go and do some stupid shit, etc. This is absolutely true. So on the comparative, this will not happen. When these parties come into power, they're extremely problematic. They ban things like abortion, they create radical redistribution when they're communists and do this sort of thing. But you also get, for all these reasons, if it is policy not changed, you get attacks versus Turks, both personal and mental attacks, so it's very harmful. For all these reasons, please oppose these scandals.
I thank the speaker very much for the speech. Confirm that my wing is ready. In which case, we welcome the apologies. We welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the OG And confirming my wing is ready. Yep. Then I turn to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close off top half. Here.
Before I start my speech, I just want to say two things. The first is, Ahmed, you're not American for this round. You're third for this round, my brother. I am so very sorry.
Mashallah.
But the second and very important thing is, a great Bulgarian hero of this exact once said, if I lose only myself. If I win for all of Bulgaria. So, you know. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. A sam bulgarski vojvoda, momci mi sa tes, ni letime za svoboda, krov dalem dnes. Now, this is a song about killing Turks. This song was already written. This song already exists. They do not unwrite this song. This is not a retrospective motion. This is from day one. Should we do a different thing or should we not do a different thing? I'm going to engage with a couple of things, their responses to us, and then I'm going to flip them in a second, completely different way, in this sort of way. Firstly, to their responses on, oh, but your reasons don't actually happen because, you know, we can get generational change. No reason why we can get generational change? Nothing like this. Here is why it's very difficult to get generational things. One, this requires an entire change of your base identity, of who your heroes are, of the ideals that you call good in this sort of way. To do, because the requirement isn't just to introduce a new comparative identity. The necessary thing is to destroy the current identity, which is extremely difficult to do over time because it remains in people's minds with emotional. Also, secondly, this comes from everywhere currently in society. And here they say, but the curriculum is accepted as potentially more credible. This could be true, but when from every other place this sort of thing comes in, when from your songs, your folklore, all of these things, when from, how do you say, all political parties are nationalists to some degree in us, they all push these sort of patriotic narratives, then I think many people are going to be affected by these sorts of things. What does this mean in this sort of way? What this means is that all of their things that they say we did not engage with them, they never give reasons why this is fixed. They never give reasons why people stop seeing Turks as scandalous. What we would say is people's conception of the Turks within our country is already built. It's already created through all of these sorts of years of this thing happening, and they're unlikely to be able to reverse it, and they never give analysis to this. Also, the second thing it means is if CO wants to run a comparative identity is actually worse, this would be a stub because we say there would be no comparative identity. This is the identity that is likely to remain. And if they give reasons contradicting us, then they are stabbing us in this sort of way, and you should not create it. But secondly, onto their responses to, this is not going to be such a big reaction. Firstly, they say, people will not vote for scandalous policies. I just want to say, all of your country voted for Trump. Why does this happen? Because average guy does not care about what is best. Average guy is interchanged by emotionality. Again, level of political involvement is low. Which kind of people are likely to get politically involved asymmetrically by this? People who only care about this policy, for whom this is an important part of their identity, for whom this is emotional in this sort of way. I don't know why they would not vote for these sorts of crazy policies. But secondly, they say there wouldn't be this huge reaction because nobody cares. This is not true. Why? Because everybody cares about this. This is what your kids learn. This is the values that they are given by their school. Again, American example. You people go crazy over critical race theory. Imagine if they wanted to teach you that there was no revolution against the British. Imagine how crazy those guys would go then. Also, secondly, even if it is not that scandalous, the thing in and of itself, it's likely to be switched in this way. Nationalists are likely to push this in the media. They're likely to attack it. They say there is no big media coverage, but media is owned by parties. They're associated with parties. If it's in their interest to push it, they will push it in this sort of way. But finally, they say not everyone is going to become nationalist. Firstly, this is fine. But we say middle guy becomes nationalist. And this is important because this means that nationalist parties now get into parliament. Nationalist parties now go from having maybe 20% to 30%. This gives them way more political power to do coalitions, way more political power to do very scandalous things. Also, secondly, and this is the final weighing against them, is let's say no more people become nationalists than currently would. The pre-existing ones become way there is an attack against them, that their identity is being destroyed. This is how you get a person who generically is nationalist to go out to action, to go out to attack others, because they perceive that there is a war and an attack happening in this sort of way. But finally, I want to respond to closing government's framing. If people are that nationalist, won't nothing happen. People are not turbo right-wing here. This is not the issue. The issue is everyone has an emotional association with this. Everyone on the political spectrum is affected by this sort of thing. Because it has been studied by us for so long, but also because of all the structural reasons Rumen gave. So those people, the people in the middle who are not so involved, they're the ones where there will be delta. Now, I want to flip them in a second way by saying, actually, it's not that scandalous, this sort of thing, this sort of education. And this is for 4 reasons. One, we have been able to get incremental changes over time for it to become better because of influence by actors like the European Union, influence by actors like the Turkish lobby, and all of these things. These actors are not strong enough to stop a backlash that would happen, but they're strong enough over time to get little changes and to make it comparatively better. Also, secondly, this is an educational system. There are limits. You need to teach facts, true things. You cannot teach falsehoods in this sort of way. So this limits this sort of thing that you cannot push that scandalous things. But thirdly, it's catered to different groups. This like kids study this sort of thing. You cannot tell them Turkish are scandalous. Turks study Bulgarian schools. They have some degree of regulation over this sort of thing. So you cannot tell them, no, you are the most scandalous sort of guys in this sort of way. It's like a racist framing that we're all hooga booga and we teach in this sort of way. Before I go on, CG.
Yeah, look, if it's the case, as you say, that European countries are not going to be able to exert this influence, why is it that in the first place you're so heavily reliant on them for economic aid and for political stability? Surely you will listen to them.
No, look, they may be able to. Like, okay, yes, if Germany goes like, we want Bulgaria to do what they want, they might be able to, but they don't care. They have their own problems to deal with. They have their own economic conditions. They would not cut off trade with Bulgaria for this one issue because it's not as important to their voters, but it is the most important thing for Bulgarian voters. And then this is the thing. Alternative to how you're likely to be taught about the Turks is much, much worse because you're likely to be taught by your family who tells you stories, who tells you all of these things, or by politicians who give you this sort of information to shape your identity. Why is this much worse? Because when these people tell you lies, you now do not have the facts you have garnered to school to counter them. If they tell you a falsehood, like a slaughter happened, it didn't actually happen, you now do not have the knowledge of this. And notice, you're likely to be much more radicalized because people are much more emotional than the school in this sort of way, because I analyze structurally why school is comparatively likely to be better in these people. This then means we flip them in 2 ways, because if they say Islamophobia, Turkophobia, we say if there is backlash, it's likely to happen much, much worse, because the 15% that are likely to backlash are the ones who do the most, the ones who beat up the most, who take political action the most. But we also say, even if this thing is bad, the alternative is much, much worse, so they get none of their benefits, and we get all of these sorts of things. Both us.
I thank the speaker very much for their speech. I can confirm that my panelist is ready. Awesome. Loving the double thumbs up. We turn to closing half, and I welcome the member of government to start CG off. Here.
Hi, can I check that you can hear me clearly? Okay, one moment. Let me just get this ready. POIs in the chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, One. Look, top half cannot win this debate. The issue is that OG did not bother proving why there's a better counterfactual on their side, and at the same time opening a position while they argue something which may plausibly be true in the real world, do not mechanize many of their claims. So what I'm going to do in this speech then is 4 things. First of all, I'm going to go through the opening opposition case and explain why their premises are asserted and false. Secondly, I'm going to characterize how the Ottoman history curriculum is taught in school, and I want to specify that this motion is specific about Turkey because it's not just about the Muslim world, but about the Ottoman Empire. And I'm going to explain why it's thirdly, these hostility is going to be aimed at Turkey in specific. And fourthly, I'm going to explain why the counterfactual is going to be unitary messaging and why it's going to be better for us in the long term, thereby winning the debate. I want to basically attack 2 important premises that are asserted and the entirety of the OO case is based on. The first one is this idea that the church is also going to promote this messaging and therefore it's going to exist on both sides in the long term. Note that Ruman doesn't actually prove why this is true. I have 3 reasons why this is false. 1, the church needs to remain on good terms with Turkey and sanctions bishops who do not do this, exactly because there are strong connections with the Orthodox Patriarchate, which is in Constantinople in the first place, and therefore you need to be able to continue this unison. Secondly, the church prefers to positively showcase how they have been helping society right now, as opposed to stressing hostilities that happened 200 years ago. I do not know why the church is likely to care about this, but also thirdly, politicians are likely to rein in adverse church messaging that affects international relations, and I do not know why the church is going to be able to resist this pressure. Therefore, I do not think this stands from a wall. The second thing I'm going to respond to, though, is this asserted idea that the backlash is not going to increase. This entire opening opposition argument is based on 2 implied premises, both of which I'm going to remove from the debate. The first is that the premise that the government is going to do this in the most scandalous manner, and the second premise is that most people care deeply about whether Ottoman Empire history is taught in school. First of all, why is the state going to do this well? 3 reasons. 1, politicians are aware of the political harms of doing this like very suddenly or very badly, as opening opposition explains, and therefore you're likely to phase this out in the long term or do this slowly or in a way that presents well. Secondly, instead of saying we're going to remove this, you're likely to focus on the positive side of the history you're replacing it with, and therefore you're able to focus on other historical successes that people also care about in this. But thirdly, you're also able to receive backing from historians that talk about how important your country's history is, and therefore you're able to create a campaign that explains why these are more important. But secondly, why is it the case that most people don't actually care about what's in the school history curriculum? Again, 3 reasons here. 1, what you're taught in school is a small and subliminal part of your childhood, right? Like most people, especially if they're as uneducated as OO say, probably barely remember what happened in school. They get the vibes from it, but I don't think they specifically remember what the curriculum entails, and it's not the important part of their politics. Secondly, as OO concedes, you can perceive your identity to be separate from what is taught in school, right? You can still choose to identify with these heroes in their personal lives, so you do not have to essentially need for them to be taught in school, therefore do not know why you care about this so deeply. But also thirdly, there are probably more pertinent national issues to currently focus on, right? This part of history took place 200 years ago. No one from the time is alive. People are probably very dispassionate, and this is just something which is taught in school to you. I do not know why you're likely to care about this. What are the implications of the response I've given? 3 things here. First of all, backlash is going to be symmetric at best on their side. Secondly, people who are not nationalists will think backlash over this from the right wing is probably overblown, especially because the government is going to frame this well. But thirdly, harassment is going to be reduced in the long term on our side, as I'm going to explain, when we change the minds of children, as they'll explain. First argument then, why the Ottoman history curriculum is taught badly. 3 things here. First of all, it's likely to be old-fashioned and inert, right? This is history from 200 years ago. Sources are old, and there's currently no political incentives on their side to improve the teaching or to do this in a way that is actually positive. Secondly, it is simplified in the focus on great men, exactly, because this is really old history, and you need to help kids relate to it, and therefore you dumb it out, you make it hostile toward Turkey. It's a different context. But also thirdly, children are very suggestible, especially to this sort of nationalist messaging, exactly because they're young, they do not have preformed opinions, and they trust the teachers. Therefore, the teaching is likely to be very hostile. Second argument then, why these hostilities are going to be aimed specifically against Turkey. I think the important thing to note is that the Ottoman Empire is perceived as the predecessor of the modern Turkish state, right? As in Kemal overthrew the empire to form Turkey, the national and cultural identity is the same. Therefore, this is where you're directed. So 2 reasons here. Actually, two burdens. First of all, why Turkey is currently portrayed as the continuation of the Ottoman Empire. 3 subclaims here. 1, Erdogan's political messaging is linked with like Turkey being the continuation of the empire, especially because of the Islamic ideals he's promoting. Secondly, you have cultural continuations, I explained. But also thirdly, it is easier to explain in school when a kid asks, like, where's the Ottoman Empire? You just say, it's Turkey in the past, right? They are perceived as the successors. Second burden for this argument, why people take out this anger on Turkey in specific. 3 reasons here. 1, as Zoe says, is a key part of your national identity. Secondly, you lack direct contact with Turkish people. Therefore, it is very easy to vilify them. But thirdly, the visual depiction of these specific crimes in the history books means that you're likely to backlash against them. The impacts of this is that you're now, 1, one, irrationally refusing to engage in beneficial geopolitical agreements with Turkey, but secondly, you now also on their side get more aggression against people like Turkish minorities in places like Thrace or southeastern Bulgaria. Fourthly, then, why is the counterfactual going to be unitary messaging, and why this works in the long term on our side? Before that, I'll quickly take opening up.
No matter how well the state does this, A, it will be portrayed bad, and B, people have emotional reaction to this. But if the state can portray it well, of Alex's reasons as to why it's good to be in the educational system to counterbalance all the other messagings kick in.
Look, I refuse the premise that people care about political, like school messaging that much, as in curricula change every year. I do not know why people are going to care about this as much, especially if it's phased out over 5 or 10 years, for example. I don't think this works. Why is the counterfactual going to be much better then? First of all, nationalism just is not necessary anymore, and the comparative is likely to focus on things like, pro-Balkan or pro-European messaging. Why is this true? 5 reasons here. One, the current economic situation, right? Given the post-COVID situation and Russian sanctions, this means that it has become increasingly difficult to rely on actors like Russia for economic funding, and therefore you have a need to collaborate with your neighbors in other European countries. Secondly, European countries are themselves going to pressure you. The old preemption here says that Germany doesn't care if the Balkans are a shithole. I just don't think this is true, exactly because Balkan instability hurts the European unity, it helps the European economy, it hurts the economy, and it also fuels far-right parties within the EU itself, and therefore I think countries like Germany and France have an incentive to tell you to shut the fuck up, or they're not going to provide you as much aid anymore, especially when the EU has been responsible for a lot of funding within those states. Thirdly, though, existing diplomatic agreements, right? Countries in the former Yugoslavia, Greece, and even Turkey on many occasions have already been trying to engage in positive politics, and you have those existing agreements to rely on that you want to continue establishing, and therefore you're not likely to create a hostile agenda like CO is probably going to try to argue. Fourthly, though, there's an aversion to war because most countries are democracies, right? Unlike 100 years ago, we no longer live in the era of expansionism. It's not the case that war is seen as normal, and therefore most people are averse to going to war and to killing. But fifthly, there's a trend toward globalization, meaning that you're more able to relate to other cultures, and therefore in the long term, children are likely to be convinced. Lastly, why do children listen to this narrative in the long term? 3 reasons here. One, teachers are seen as educating sources of authority compared to most families. Secondly, most time learning is spent in school rather than in the family. But thirdly, both families and children trust in the state to do this well, and therefore this means that we convince kids in the long term. Look, I flipped a wall. I explained why the comparative is better. You have to vote for us. Thank you.
I thank the speaker very much for the speech, confirming that my panelist is ready. Yep. In which case, I welcome the member of opposition to begin the closing up case. They're here.
Cool. Can I confirm I'm clearly audible? Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Much like the Americans who brought stability to the region, I'm going to clean up this debate. None of the people in the Balkans will like our solutions, but we will win. One extension from CO, what the Americans who study these countries are going to prove, why regardless of what this emphasis looks like, the school is a unique platform to teach this history well, i.e. flipping all of Gov and explaining the benefits of teaching it this way. And secondly, why you get significantly better access to information because the way the message is internalized in school will be valuable. I'll also at the end explain why the counterfactual Chris doesn't work. On framing, I completely agree with Chris. Both top half teams don't explain at all why the methods of teaching are likely to be good or bad, which is a prerequisite for them to access any of their impacts. In fact, their framing that this is discourse in society regardless mitigates their cases in the debate massively. Because OG and O agree that the politicians talk about this regardless. It's celebrated in things like celebrations of Croatian nationalism. Everyone is quite nationalistic and very aware of these things. If this is true, if OG gets a delta in Islamophobia, it's incredibly marginal and probably non-existent insofar as the likely comparative is teaching about the Yugoslav wars more, which often involved Christian on Muslim violence. But OO is equally symmetric because if it is true that everyone is already quite nationalist, which is the implication of their analysis, firstly, governments could sell this to their population as, we want to emphasize more contemporary national heroes, i.e. talking more about Tito and Yugoslavia, and as Chris says, or two, it's clear how many more people get mad or what actually changes politically, right? Because nationalist parties are in power in virtually every Balkan state, Vucic in Serbia, Milanovic in Croatia, Kočevski in Macedonia, all these people are still in power there, unclear why they still don't have mass pluralities in the electorate. Second framing, and this is critical. What is it unique about the information received through the education system, the way it's taught, as opposed to the comparative, which is quite clearly, you still hear about all this stuff just from celebrations, political campaigns, politicians, and so on, that are still nationalist and still have incentives to talk about this and use this as a form of messaging. The comparative is that the way it is taught in schools is likely to provide better information and provide, while still being incredibly nationalist, a far more nuanced look at criticism that delinks the contemporary association between Islamophobia, contemporary struggles in the Balkans, and the crimes of the Ottomans in the past. Why is this the case? Firstly, textbooks are publicly available, and often educators care a lot about historical accuracy. This is because it's their profession. They interact with many other academics from foreign countries who care about these things and study these things as well, and they interact with teachers from foreign countries who come and teach in these regions quite frequently. Contrast this with politicians who have no such incentive and have every electoral incentive to demonize this and paint this in an incredibly nationalistic way, devoid of nuance, by linking like Kosovar Muslims to Ottoman Janissaries in the past, even though the link is non-existent. Secondly, textbooks come under significantly more external scrutiny, i.e. from the EU, NATO, the West, and things like this to a significant degree. They can be critiqued on the internet to a significantly larger extent. This is something that people in textbooks care a lot about. They're likely to correct that. Thirdly, even if you believe neither of those things, textbooks need to offer a level of detail that celebrations or campaign speeches simply cannot, because of the medium, right? Textbooks are long form. They're taught in schools over a period of time, and emphasis means you talk about it for a long time. They're meant to educate, so people have to see a lot of nuance in the degree to which it's educated, and or at least comparatively more nuance, whereas a campaign speech or celebration lasts for a fairly short amount of time, or a story on grandpa's knee is very, very brief. Fourthly, educators tend to be broadly more liberal than the rest of the populace. They're often either Western educated and therefore exposed to competing narratives about Ottoman independence, and are more likely to offer a more nuanced and detailed look at these kinds of things compared to a politician who, by Ruman and Alex analysis, is probably somewhat dumb. But finally, even if you believe it's still bad, even if you believe they're still going to demonize things, it is still comparatively better, because you're comparatively likely to get more nuanced detail and questioning in your explanations of things. What does this mean precisely for the way it is taught? Firstly, this flips all of CG, who says it's going to be done in a really terrible nationalistic manner. If that's true, they just have no comparative and the debate is a wash. If it isn't true, and you believe even one of the reasons I just gave, what changes? Firstly, there is likely to be comparatively more nuance in the criticism of the Ottoman Empire, i.e. educators with incentives to go into detail about the facts, i.e. about how the specific practices the Ottomans had differ from contemporary Muslim practice today, i.e. Ottomans believed in violent jihad, whereas today Bosniaks do not. Ottomans believed in conscripting and forced conversion through janissaries, but Kosovar Muslims believe there's no compulsion in religion because that's what's taught in the Quran. You're more likely to have discussions about that, and you're more likely to see those differences insofar as you have to, by virtue of the fact you're spending emphasis on, highlight practices that are explicitly divergent from the practices that other Muslims practice today. This flips all of OG. But secondly, there's likely more time spent on these things. The amount of emphasis placed means you get to go in far more detail to discuss issues, explore nuances of issue you otherwise miss out on. You're likely to have a more in-depth understanding of a student. Thirdly, schools have incentives to mitigate conflict between different ethnic groups in the classroom to avoid bullying, friction, and things like that, so they're likely to teach it reasonably well. But fourthly, there's more ability to engage in dialogue because it's a conversation. You can speak to teachers who can clarify things about facts. The comparative, it's not a safe space to question a nationalist politician or be the only person at a celebration critiquing or criticizing it. You have far more ability to talk about these things. What is unique then about emphasizing the history of Ottoman occupation? And this is where CG makes a fatal mistake, because they concede in saying that the teaching is likely to be hostile, that every other form of disseminating this is going to be worse. What changes? Firstly, where conflicting information exists, which is often the case because these are historic things, people need a greater degree of nuance and attention to detail. The emphasis on this curriculum is you get to sift through things like primary sources far more. You're able to get far more detail about each of these kinds of things, and you're likely to have far more conversation about what is real and what is false. We reduce misinformation rather than amplify it. But secondly, it's an incredibly large amount of your history. It's so much detail that shaped current forms of power. This is like warlords who became business owners and elites in society later in Bulgaria. It's like political parties that were formed out of the struggle, like Bomora de Paname in Macedonia, whose leaders literally fought against Turkish occupation. It's the struggle where a transition from where people to country began. So it's often info that's incredibly important. Like lots of holdover institutions from the Ottoman Empire, the role of viceroy in Ottoman times is very, very similar to the role of high representative in Bosnia today. You have vastly more information about that kind of thing. Now, Alec, at the last minute of his speech, realized this was where the comparative is and asserted that schools will teach this comparatively better. But I have no idea why, and they never explain why it's the case. They just say schools are likely to be better because it's less emotional. Alec realized where the real debate is. He didn't explain it. I explained it. Before I impact this point and then explain why you get far worse on their side, I'll take OG.
The comparative is not a world where we don't talk about the Ottoman Empire. It's where the curriculum doesn't require you to glorify or demonize certain groups. If anything, teachers are better able to push back on nationalism on our side when the curriculum doesn't tell them to glorify people.
This is precisely right. However, in the absence of the emphasis of critique, the only critique you hear is from the nationalists. That's the comparative in this debate. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, you have far more information. That's inherently good. Every individual benefits from this in unique ways and accesses them agency. Secondly, you're very good at dispelling nationalist lies. When a political leader speaks out about these kinds of things, you're far more able to critique it if you they're lying about a massacre or something like that. Alex says this, I mechanized it. Thirdly, you have access to a narrative which directly mitigates Islamophobia because your classroom is uniquely unlikely to teach the struggle in an Islamophobic manner, which flips only OG thing in its entirety. Why won't it be done well on their side? This flips the comparative because comparative is not you teach about pro-EU stuff, which is only the last 20 years. You have to teach about intra-Balkan conflict because that's where the bulk of your history is that isn't Ottoman Empire. Why is this far worse? Firstly, the counterfacts are just likely to be far more inflammatory. As I said in a POI, insofar as textbooks are bad, the shift in emphasis goes to the Yugoslav wars. Obviously, this generates far more Islamophobia because all the people who kidnapped children to be Janissaries are dead, but the people with relatives who lost family in the NATO bombing of Serbia are still alive. The people who lost relatives to the Croatian Nazi party in World War II are still alive. The harms are far more proximate to generate far more of that. When you phase out one text, but also triggers tons of backlash, you can't just do it gradually. It obviously provokes all the people. But finally, insofar as an incentive to demonize Erdogan, you talk about contemporary Turkish policy instead. So there's just no delta there in terms of that. Unitary messaging, incentives exist on both sides, but it's far, far harder when the emphasis is on intra-Balkan fighting instead. I just think this is an incredibly clear seal victory. We're the only team to mechanize how this is likely to be taught. Incredibly proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker very much for their speech and confirm my panelists are ready. Yep. Then we turn to the government whip to close off the government bench. Here.
All right, folks, can you hear me okay? Great. POIs in the chat, please. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. I think the biggest mistake that both CO and OO, unfortunately for them, make is the wild assumption that there is a fixed amount of nationalism that is inherent to countries, especially countries in the Balkans, and that if this nationalism isn't tied to the struggle against the Ottoman Empire, it will be tied to the Yugoslav wars or something else instead. But this is simply not true. Like, if you look all over the world, countries are becoming less and less nationalist over time due to things like globalization and increased migration between countries. But specifically for the Balkans, specifically when, you know, more of them are being integrated into the EU, they're receiving more EU aid, more EU support. There's an import of EU values and acceptance and things like this as well. I think Chris wins this debate by explaining why this is the likely comparative and why this is instead what's going to be focused on rather than simply shifting the nationalism elsewhere. I'm just going to emphasize the impacts that come from Chris's case then. First of all, Chris explains why there will be a lot less tension with Turkey, because Chris is the first government speaker to identify the link between modern Turkey and the Ottoman Empire historically, and therefore explains why we can reduce this huge tension. And this is the biggest impact in this debate, because as a lot of teams kind of self-mitigate in saying that there's a lot of nationalism already within the Balkans anyway, and a lot of ethnic tension. So the big delta in this debate, therefore, is going to be in relations between countries in the Balkans and other countries where there's a lot less symmetry in the impacts. That's why this impact is so important in this debate. What does Chris explain to you here? Chris explains why there's a lot less tension with Turkey. And I'm just going to further expand on those impacts, given that Chris has helpfully flagged them in advance. First of all, it means you have greater cooperation in things like the refugee crisis. Often it becomes very difficult for the EU to reach an agreement with Turkey. For example, we'll give you some money if you help us solve the refugee crisis by building some camps or stopping people going on boats. Like, because countries within the Balkans, or Greece, for example, just veto those proposals because they involve giving money to Turkey. This is something which is like a huge impact on our side at the point where we increase cooperation, as Chris explained to you. But also, given that Turkey is a prospective EU member, we don't want them doing things like buying weapons from Russia, as they did recently with the S-400 missile system. I think there's a lot less of that on our side. They're much more closely aligned with the EU at the point where we do this, and Turkey is likely to reciprocate, as Chris explained. Also, Chris actually activated the impacts from OG in terms of protected minorities within the Balkans by explaining to you why this is likely to be taught well. And also, Chris flagged why children are likely to listen to this narrative in the long term. Notice that opposition on this assert that children won't listen to the educational system, but our analysis here works even if up is correct. Even if you have backlash from the right wing, children will still listen to these teachers in preference to other sources. Why? 2 reasons. First of all, teachers are seen as educated sources of authority compared to most families. They have more evidence, they have more facts, therefore they can explain this to you more persuasively, like kind of how your country is formed or what modern Turks within your country believe, as opposed to, for example, political parties can or your families can, because they don't have the facts. Secondly, Most time learning is spent in school rather than with family. Therefore, because you spend more time in school, you're more likely to believe what's taught there than the few hours you spend at home with your family. Thirdly, both families and children trust in the state to begin with, and everything that the curriculum is good. This cultivates a positive opinion of other Balkan countries through unitary messaging. And this is really, really important for this debate because it takes down a lot of the CO claims, because CO are like, well, wouldn't it be nice if we taught them that modern Turks were nice? But like, yes, Chris explains that's exactly the likely counterfactual, that you're going to be teaching this unitary messaging. We can get all of those positive impacts on our side as well. Okay, let's weigh this against the other teams then. Firstly, against SEAL. SEAL have a single response to Chris, shame, which is to assert that people care deeply about the history that is taught because it's a big part of their lives. Chris already preempts this in the extension speech when he gives you multiple reasons that history is not as relevant to you in the present as it was in the past. SEAL claim that education is better, and I'm going to rebut all of the reasons that they give here. First of all, they say that it's written by academics who care what's written with them. These academics are hired by the state and are likely to be party appointees with specific tasks to like bolster state nationalism. So I don't think that mechanism from SEAL lands. Their second mechanism is that you have external scrutiny from the EU on these textbooks. Like the main response here is just to say that it's not really so much about like what's in the textbooks. It's about how that's framed by your teacher, the language that they use, the visual imagery that they use in a slideshow. Like this is very difficult to scrutinize by an EU external government body. So I don't think that this mechanism lands either. Thirdly, they say that you're more likely to be liberal than the public because these teachers are Western educated. Unclear why this is true of primary and secondary school teachers. It's going to be like some local guy in your village who's teaching you this very nationalist stuff. Like how on earth are you going to scrutinize that externally? Fourthly, they say that you're likely to have inspections. Again, this is not true in many remote regions as well. So you'll then say that you have like more nuanced discussion in these classrooms, and that's really good. But these are school children, right? They're not master's students in this kind of stuff like Matt is. They're not capable of having that very nuanced discussion. Also, these are like very violent and graphic events. I think teachers will want to skim over them and not go into much detail. They're going to be left with the vibes, which is Turks bad, Greece good, rather than the nuanced discussion that CO unrealistically portrays this as. The conclusion then is that CO's impacts either don't accrue or also happen on our side at the point where the likely counterfactual is the unitary messaging that I think all teams actually want in this debate, proven to you uniquely by Chris at extension. Let's compare this against OO. Before I do though, a quick PY from them, please.
Panel, do not let bottom have strawman us. We explicitly explained why on the comparative these people would not radicalize and why they will radicalize when you touch their national identity. But we also explained why the comparative will still be you care about.
Thanks, Ruben. I'll rebut that in a second. Thanks, guys. Okay. OO say that there's still some nationalism. I'm going to rebut them in 4 different ways. First of all, this entire point is just mitigation. So if we show some comparative change in less nationalism, this is still a win for side government. Second response, they say that nationalist parties will push this line and there are other sources of nationalism. But children don't watch party political broadcasts. Like by the time you're grown up, you've had 18 years of school teachers teaching you that EU values, that being united is good and that we should forget about our past historical divisions. At that point, you see those party political broadcasts through a different lens. And it's completely unclear why on opposition side, the children in the future still believe this nasty divisive messaging. Third response, they say that this is common knowledge already, that the Turks are bad in these countries. But it's common knowledge amongst like old people, not so much like unborn, like newborn children, which is the people we care about as in future generations. So again, their mechanisms don't really connect to these children in the future as well. They say, okay, so I think this takes down their point on why there's still some nationalism and explains why actually we reduced that a lot on our side, especially going long-term into the future. And let's quickly do some weighing here. Sure, maybe in the short term, we'll get some backlash. But we mitigate this a lot already. Notice that in the long term, we get a lot less hatred. So if you look to future generations, maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now, these newborn children won't be exposed to all this whole hatred. Through the school, they'll be taught much more unitary, like EU-style messaging. This would be a really good thing for reducing division in the future. Why should you care more about the long term than the present term? This is really intuitive. There are more people that live in the future than live currently. Therefore, as we impact more people, you should care more about the impacts from our side. So lastly, let's compare against opening government. I think Chris already does this in his speech. Basically, he fills in key missing links and gives you the most important impact in this debate, which is, look, there's going to be ethnic tensions in the Balkans anyway. Come on, guys, it's kind of part of our identity. But what really matters is the relations between countries in the Balkans and other countries externally like Turkey. We explain why we get huge improvements there from our side. And for that reason, you should stand with closing government. Thanks.
I thank the speaker very much for the speech and confirm that the panelist is ready. In which case, I welcome the opposition whip to close up the closing op case, the op bench, and the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Hey everyone, Matt, mute yourself. Am I audible? Okay, can I just confirm that, can somebody say something so I can hear if I'm getting
Hello.
called for a POI?
Hello.
Great, okay, I can hear. For POIs, please put them in the chat. Don't verbally interrupt me because it throws me off my game. Just making sure I have my stopwatch out. Great. Okay. So, for those of you that don't know, this is a Turkish Alp helmet from the Ottoman Empire that I got on Amazon. I think it will be very clear why we're going to rule over every other team in the round. Great. 3, 2, 1. Ruben and Alex said we're not Americans this round, but ironically, they turned American when they ran the generic Backlash case with better English than we would have probably. I want to make the comparative very clear before going into each team. If you believe they'll teach it badly, it's worse to have them teach the more recent history badly because it's more pertinent and salient. If you believe they can teach it well, this is an issue schools must teach because the comparative of where people hear and learn about it will be worse. I want to make a couple of things more clear in terms of CG's responses to us and then go into CG. I want to make something very, very clear. Obviously, they can still teach about the Ottoman Empire to an extent on either side. The problem with this is that OG themselves say the likely comparative is fixating on other things if you don't talk about the struggle against the Ottoman Empire and the particular places where you need to emphasize where more nuance is required. Secondarily, if you talk generically about the Ottoman Empire without critique, you don't have any idea which massacres were real and which weren't. Secondarily, I want to make clear, Matt did not say we teach the Ottoman Turks history in a really nice way. Matt said, one, that there are incentives to provide nuance by applying criticism to the Ottoman Empire specifically, rather than tying it to, for example, modern Muslims in Kosovo, which delinks the Islamophobia. Secondly, even if it's the case that this education is explicitly very, very nationalist, that is fine. Matt explained why the information provided via nationalism is actually super good or comparatively better than the leaders, for example, providing it. The detail about the struggle specifically allows you to get a far deeper understanding of contemporary politics in the region, the political leaders who came out from particular hierarchies and dynasties, how political parties formed from the inception of the transition from the Ottoman Empire. The point of this is that political leaders simply don't have that similar incentive to provide that nuance. He also explained why the focus on anti-Ottoman trades off against more discussion in the classroom with hostility versus Yugoslavia and the breakup there. You talk about other violence that happened during the breakup of Yugoslavia, etc., on their side. So we get comparatively more room for unifying narratives on our side to take hold, where there is that potential and there's less ethnic group split. The responses to us are that I want to make clear, our case is not contingent on the amount of nationalism that exists. Our case is contingent on providing better education to people. Matt explained that the history of Balkan states is profoundly shaped by the struggle against Ottoman oppression. I want to be very clear why we take out CG. Their case relies on it being taught badly on our side. Note, all of their rebuttal to op is reasons why it wouldn't be taught super bad, or the reasons why it won't be taught super badly exist on both sides, i.e. likely backing from historians, proper campaigns. All of their rebuttal actually exists on both sides. But secondarily, also, all of their rebuttal to why it wouldn't be taught well on our side is why they can't teach the alternative well on their side as well. Children can't understand nuance, etc. So their rebuttal would have to also decrease the tipping point that their own case has. But secondarily, their case relies on the alternative being a unitary message. But note that all of their analysis for it symmetrically applies for why they won't teach it on our side in a way that says you should massacre Turks or other ethnic groups that supported the Ottomans. You can paint the struggle against the Ottomans as a unifying one of all ethnic groups in the country coming together, i.e. the incentives that they give European countries pressuring you, the current economic situation, also apply on both sides. So there's so much tension within their case. Finally, on tension with Turkey, I think there's no delta here, because if you choose to focus instead on modern history, i.e. EU accession, for example, you are likely to focus on contemporary Turkish harms, i.e. predatory Turkish investment by the AKP. But also I think this is just largely marginally comparative because Greece and Croatia are in the EU, but many Balkan countries are not. What is the real comparative on why we win? We are completely isolated to the motion, which is why do schools need to emphasize in particular the struggle, not just the Ottomanness or like the Ottoman history, but the struggle against it. Because every other avenue you hear about the struggle is structurally inferior and less nuanced than schools when discussing the struggle. Schools might have flaws, but comparatively less. And secondarily, the struggle itself is something that requires you to emphasize particularly because of the fact that there are competing accounts and missing information and all of the stuff that CG themselves tell you. That's why you need to emphasize, because there are the gaps that you need to focus on. Children need to know that the info their grandpa and pastor tell them is not the full story, that there are missing parts to the actual dialogue. We apply to both characterizations. If you think they can't do it well, you said Matt smells, he didn't give you any good analysis, then we let them focus on the old shit instead of the new shit that is more salient and likely to cause harm. But secondarily, if you do think that they can do it well, they have a comparative advantage to teaching this history than the alternatives that exist in the world that will in fact be teaching about it. On OO, they almost get to the real op case when Alex says school is likely to be better because it's less emotional than the alternative, so they try to flip OG there. Note that's where their analysis stops. I don't really have to explain why Matt fills in all of the gaps besides explaining why it's not just that schools aren't emotional, but the infrastructure and institutions that they're built upon. Why do we beat OO now? Their case relies on a flimsy premise, which is that Gov's world is one in which the school curriculum is stupid and literally takes a shit on the old leaders and burns the textbook chapters about it. I don't know why shifting emphasis is the same or equal to it will be perceived as erasure, for example. All of their backlash arguments are contingent on weaponizing this feeling of identity, right? We don't disagree. This is a hot button issue, central to their identity. Everybody cares about this. But they don't explain the link for why a shift in emphasis is the same as not talking about it at all or saying that you are erasing the history entirely in and of itself. That is critical. CG, to their credit, do point it out, but I want to explain why that outweighs beneath us. Secondarily, their case talks about the harms of not doing it, but not the benefits of actually doing it. Why do people deserve this information? What do they gain out of it? What is isolated to the motion? Thirdly, before explaining why nationalist backlash is symmetric and going into OG, I'll give them a chance quickly. OG, POI.
If you're right and teachers are liberal and decrease conflict, increasing their focus on talking about recent conflicts, which is your comparative, seems to be a good thing. They can push back against the bad racist narratives that you say are super important right now, too.
No. Understand the case. Our case is, if we buy into your characterization, it's particularly why it's better to focus on the old history than the new history. If you don't buy their characterization, the past history is the one that has more of the gaps that need to be filled, that has the structural incapacity to be able to be taught. So I don't want us to be perceived as us having tension. We engage in their characterization and flip it, but also ours. Why is nationalist backlash symmetric? I agree, I won't strawman. They said this is a hot button issue everyone, even the moderates, care about. But they don't explain particularly why the nationalists don't have other content to mobilize their base, i.e. current events, Turkish incursion. If you're a nationalist, you have the same incentive on either side as a leader. The difference is what capacity you have to now mobilize people. They never explain why this is a necessary tool in the toolbox to do that. On OG, Matt already did the rebuttal to it, but largely their case and impacts are not mutually exclusive because it's reliant on how history frames the way people think. What they needed to explain why is a history curriculum shapes people's perception of history. I don't know why that's the case insofar as the entertainment industry exists. You're going to sit on your grandfather's lap and hear about the history. So you still have a conception of the history and that frames the way you think, but I don't know why the history curriculum is now going to be the thing that you otherwise need. Never been prouder to oppose this motion and win. The Ottomans took it.
Perfect. I think this